The Count Lucanor begins by introducing Hans, a boy who was celebrating his 10th birthday. Hans lived in a modest home with his mother, while his father was absent in his life ever since he went off to fight in a war a long time ago. For his 10th birthday, Hans wanted to celebrate by having his own adventure, but his mother was initially hesitant of going through with this idea. After Hans became more and more assertive about it, eventually, his mother allowed him to go out, but made sure that he was readily stocked with whatever supplies he may have needed for the journey. After a long day of adventuring, Hans eventually passed out from all the excitement. After having an awful nightmare, Hans awoke only to find himself in a different world. Although everything looked the same, it was as though the world had pulled back its curtain to reveal its darker side to Hans. This is when a mysterious creature appears, and for some reason, Hans knew he had to follow it to be safe again. Unexpectedly, following the creature led Hans towards a castle hidden amongst the forest, and this blue kobold informs him of its true intentions for going there. The blue kobold offered Hans a chance to become the next heir of Lucanor. He would be able to inherit all of the riches that he could dream of, along with being able to live in the castle as well. Although this sounded like a good deal, there was most certainly a catch to it. First, Hans had to go through a trial where he needed to figure out the blue kobold's name before he was deemed worthy of this inheritance. And so, without much hesitation, Hans accepted the deal and thus began his new journey in Tenebrae Castle. In order to pass the trial, you have to search through every room in the castle and find notes that contain one letter that will give you a hint of the blue kobold's name. Although there is a way to figure out the name without doing this, most players will likely pass the trial this way if it's their first time playing this game. Inside each of these rooms are different puzzles that lead to a treasure chest containing the notes. In order to access a room, however, players must have a color-coded key tailored to the color of the banner next to the door of the room they want to enter. You can obtain these keys by talking to characters around the castle and checking what needs to be done to get a specific key. Once you start your exploration, you will notice that there are 2 floors that make up this castle. On the first floor, you have rooms that can be accessed by having green, red, and blue keys. On the second floor, there are another set of rooms that only need a gold key. These particular set of rooms differ from the first floor because they are optional rooms that you don't need to access to complete the game. However, if you do want to enter these rooms, you must collect enough coins to buy the gold key from the merchant. Speaking of collecting coins, this game has a very unique way of saving your progress. So if you want to save your game, first, you need to have a coin and then give it to the raven on the castle gardens fountain. This is a very interesting feature because it puts pressure on the player to make some hard decisions early on about how they want to spend their money. Before I move on, I must also mention that if you're a completionist type and you're not using a walkthrough for the first time you play this game, all the items that you'll be spending your coins on other than saving your game is vital in unlocking certain achievements. Finding enough coins in this game is actually very hard to do, so it's inevitable that you'll miss some optional events for your first playthrough. After you spend some time collecting notes and getting familiar with the layout of the castle, there's going to be a time when guards will start to come out and patrol the hallways. These creepy creatures are monsters who want to stop you from passing the trial. So because you're only a 10-year-old boy, you cannot fight any of them because if you do, they will kill you. Instead, the game makes you either hide behind objects or use candles that you can collect. This item is very useful for being able to see through the darkness and avoiding the guards. One cool thing about having candles at your disposal is that they can also serve as markers since you can put them down on the ground almost anywhere you want to in the castle. You can also pick them back up if you want to do something else with them as well. On a much briefer note, when you're exploring each room of the castle, you'll also be able to find treasure chests that not only contain items, but a series of notes left by a previous person who took on the trial before. These notes are very helpful in giving you tips for upcoming puzzles and learning more about the history of Tenebrae Castle. My thoughts about the visual designs for this game are very conflicted, since on one hand, I think the cutscenes for this game are amazing since it shows off the characters and scenery very well through beautiful pixel art and animations. On the other hand, when the cutscenes are over, the game switches to a different pixel art style that isn't quite as impressive. This reminds me a lot of back when games would have amazing looking cutscenes, but when they were over, the actual game wouldn't look nearly as nice. However, since it seems like the purpose for this design choice was to let the cutscenes emphasize specific moments in this game, the switch is tolerable. My only wish though, is that the in-game visual design was a more detailed pixel art style that was closer to the cutscenes, so that the transitions could be a lot smoother and less jarring. Although there are some creative moments done with the sound design for this game, overall, I feel like it's not something that I was very impressed with. For one, most of the sounds in this game seem to be generic stock sound effects. I've always been a person who thinks that sound design is important for setting the tone for how much I want to be invested into the world of a new game, especially if it's a game that's a part of the horror genre. With that said, I feel like the sound effects constantly reminded me that this was just a game and it didn't help me feel very immersed inside of that world. On a more positive note, the moments when the music in this game kicks in are great. I love that it makes me feel like I'm inside a spooky tale and it fits so well with the atmosphere of traversing through a creepy castle. One of the more creative uses of sound effects I've noticed is how the game indicates when a monster is nearby. Depending on who is coming, there will be a sound effect that gets louder or softer relative to how close you are to encountering that monster. This was an extremely useful feature for the times when you're walking through a narrow corridor in total darkness, and it also adds much more creepiness to the game itself. One of the better aspects of the Count Lucanor is the level designing of the castle. For example, you can find vents throughout the castle that you can crawl through as another way to enter a certain room, or even lead to another room that you've never seen before. Sometimes these vents can even contain items that can be useful for later. Like I mentioned earlier, the rooms that you can enter each have their own unique puzzles. For example, in one room, there is a puzzle that involves moving through grates spewing fire in a specific pattern. In another room is a puzzle that involves moving through a maze that is filled with traps in total darkness with only your candle lighting the way. Generally, most of the puzzles in this game are not difficult to solve and will only take you a couple of minutes to complete. Although there isn't any puzzle that was particularly innovative, I feel like each puzzle I encountered was varied enough from each other for me to not get bored. If you're looking for a horror game that can be played multiple times in different ways and want to be able to experience different endings by doing so, then I think this game will satisfy your needs. You'll be able to make some choices when talking to characters that will affect future gameplay features and the ending you'll get. For example, by helping certain characters early in the story, you'll be able to earn some items later that can help make the game easier. I don't want to spoil anything, but there are so many optional things that you can do in this game that is practically begging to be replayed over and over again. Although most of the features I've mentioned so far has kept this game on my good side, I must acknowledge that there are so many things that I didn't like about this game and that I felt held it back from being excellent. There were a lot of problems I noticed throughout the game that I think can be categorized into two features: how the main character moves and the intelligence of the monsters. First off, when you start playing the beginning of the game, you will quickly notice that once you're able to move as Hans, you cannot run at all, which is very odd since you're playing as a 10-year-old boy inside of a horror game. Although I have no problem with not allowing the character to run in order to build the tension of the story, when you have the option to explore an area, not being able to run around and explore quick enough to get back to experiencing the story breaks up all the tension the story has been building, especially with how slow Hans moves in this game. As a matter of fact, the pace at which Hans moves is so slow that it made exploring certain areas very tedious. This problem became even more apparent when running into a monster and trying to escape from it. It's kind of hilarious to see Hans just slowly walking away from a monster that's trying to kill him like it was nothing, when in reality, many people in that situation would try to run. If there was a way for Hans to move a little bit faster, then I think that would improve the urgency of tense situations and will make the game a lot scarier. As for the monsters, I feel like they were not as threatening as they seemed to be, and if there were a couple of adjustments to their behaviors, then I think I would have liked them a lot more. For example, I would have loved it if the monsters in this game were a lot more aggressive when they noticed you. It gets way too easy to escape from a monster because they don't chase you down long enough. It also would have been a cool idea if the guards would check hiding places if you left a bunch of candles on the floor. Seeing a monster not trying to find where I am after I leave a bunch of candles everywhere makes the enemies seem clueless. Every new type of enemy introduced in this game tends to feel the same, and I would have liked it if each enemy type had different behaviors so that trying to escape from them didn't feel so repetitive. After you spend a lot of time playing this game, a lot of the scariness of the monsters tend to dissipate and they become more of a nuisance than a threat. Finally, there are a couple of other problems that I noticed early in the game that became quite an annoyance later. For example, there is a persistent bug of some sort when Hans will get stuck in place for a couple of seconds after you're done interacting with an object. This wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that there are certain puzzles or side quests that requires you to get a certain item that's close to a monster. You could easily get killed due to this bug because you can't escape quick enough. Since you'll be encountering traps in this game, the way Hans moves could have been better as well because it feels way too stiff. Often, I would accidentally run into traps and get stuck onto objects because of this problem. In conclusion, I think that Count Lucanor was a good game that suffered a lot from its missteps in gameplay mechanics and makes me hesitant to recommend that everybody should play this game. Improving the behavior of the enemies and adding more options for how you can control your character would have made this game so much better and much more scarier. The strongest feature for this game is definitely in its way of storytelling, and since you can complete this game in a couple of hours, I do think you should pick up this game when it's on a discount. If you do decide to buy this game, then I recommend coming in with very low expectations because there is still so much that needs to be improved. If there's any consolation I can give to those of you who are interested in this game, I can assure you that the high replayability and big reveals for the endings are worth it alone for me to encourage you to check this game out.